Alright guys, welcome back. We are going to move on to Illustrator for this video. So, I've got Illustrator 2021 open here, and one of the things I want to point out first is that it's very similar to a lot of the things we covered in Photoshop. For all intents and purposes, you've got pretty much the same opening config settings here. You've got the same choices between pixels and inches, feet. So you've got all the different settings here you can go with. You've got bleed settings, color mode, raster, and I'll get into raster, but it's one of the things I want to talk about tonight is the difference between what you'll be doing in Illustrator versus what you were doing in Photoshop. All right. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on web right here. So I'm just going to go with this default setting. I don't need to go with anything crazier than that. We'll just go with that for now and we'll get working. So I'm going to hit create and we will load in there. Alright, so let's see, right off the top, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a rectangle. It's M on the keyboard, but it's also this little square right here, and then you can hold it down and it gives you a bunch of different options here for different tools. Alright. So you've got rounded rectangle, or you've got standard rectangle, you've got a rounded rectangle. L is the third option down, and that actually gets its own hotkey as, an ellipse, as the what's both. If you hold down Shift, you can get a circle. If you don't hold down Shift, you get an ellipse. The other options here is polygon, which is going to be it draws the line from the center to where the mouse is. That's different from the star tool, which goes. No, that wasn't right. I'm thinking of something else. Never mind, forget that. So there are some modifications with these tools here. So let me just jump back a couple spots. Cancel that. Okay, so when you're drawing these tools right here, you can hold down Shift and that will constrain that to an angle like that, so I can draw a perfect square instead of just doing a rectangle. The other option is I can start drawing, and then if I hold down Alt on the keyboard, that might be Option, I think, for Mac. You can hold down Alt and you'll instead be drawing from the center, and then Shift will constrain it. So you can draw that in a couple different ways. For the rounded rectangle, those controls are pretty much the same. No big difference there. The one difference for those rounded rectangles is that you are by Jeez, there's so many of those. Alright, is that you're by default going to have these rounded edges right here. And so you can click on these and drag them in, and you'll see right here that there's a setting in the menu to control how much that curve is, and at least in this case a pixel basis. You can also, I want to get to that in a minute. You can also change the corners individually. So if I click on just that one corner, you can see how these are kind of it's a circle and then a dot in the center, but if I click on this one once, it just becomes like a bolded line, and then I can just adjust this one individually from the others. That same effect is available on your rectangles, and then just a rounded rectangle is a rectangle with that feature applied. Okay, so back to, let's see. So ellipse, same idea. Hold down Alt, you can draw a circle from the center. Now polygons and stars are where it starts getting interesting. If I'm going to start drawing this right here, what I can do is hit up and down on the keyboard, and you can see that the number of faces is going to change. And similarly, if I hold down Shift, I can get it to stick up in one direction without rotating. Oh, drew that one super big. Okay. And then just like the squares, and we'll see in the star as well, again, this shape here is here so that you can adjust that angle, and then you can see that effectively it's a star if you pull it all the way, or a circle if you pull it all the way in. Now the star is basically that same process. Up and down on the keyboard, you change the number of faces, and then if you hold down Control, you can change how that outside point goes in, or at least the mouse controlled point. And then if you hold down let's see. I guess it is just that one. My brain's thinking of something else tonight. All right, so a couple different tools, couple different ways to place them. Now, if I can slide this camera over just a little bit, we end up with somewhat of the same menu options down here. In Photoshop, we had the foreground and the background, and in Illustrator, we're going to have instead the fill and the stroke. So the fill is always going to be on top here, and again, you can hit X to swap them. If I change the fill, and again, same menus that we had here that you would have been familiar with from Photoshop. So applying a fill does that, but you have to switch over to the line, and you can change the stroke. All right. So line and stroke, I'm probably going to use them interchangeably. Just it's officially labeled stroke here. And right. Anyway, so. You can hit X to switch between which one is highlighted, but your stroke will always remain your stroke, and your fill will always remain your fill. And then, just like with Photoshop, if you hit D, it'll reset it back to that default. Now, you do have the option to go back there, click on this little arrow, swappy arrow right here, and do Shift X, and that one will swap those two values if you want to do that. Okay. So, the next thing that I want to kind of focus on, that's kind of basic movement, placing stuff down, is first selection. Selection is a big thing in this program, and because what you're doing in Illustrator is working with a series of lines instead of pixels, you can do kind of different modifications. So, as far as rasterization, a couple people asked me after the last class, what does rasterize mean? Because a couple of you stumbled across that in the menu. So when you're in Illustrator, you're working with these lines right here in general. And these lines are basically a mathematical point to point to point, mathematical fill, and all that other stuff. The advantage of using and what is called as vector graphics versus pixel graphics is that I can scale this up immensely. I can keep scaling this up, and you don't see any of that pixel. Oh, that's a lot of green. And you don't see any of that pixel loss no matter what happens. Okay? Whereas if I was to then, I don't think I can do it through this menu, and I can't see my menu up here, so let's try and find it. Okay, so here's that rasterize option, and it's going to give me this option here to choose the color mode, again RGB, CMYK, in this case I'll leave it RGB, and then the resolution, high at 300 ppi, which is synonymous with DPI. So when I do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit OK with right there, and I probably shouldn't have done it at this size. Let me actually go back to something smaller. Okay, let's rasterize that. So there it is. Sorry, I don't know what menu that is. I'll have to figure that out later. So when I do this rasterization process, you can see that again, we've gone back to pixels. These were the pixels we were working with in Photoshop, but we've simplified, well, not simplified, we've actually made it more complex, but we've taken what was a mathematical line and converted it into a very static grid of pixels. So what's the huge difference here? If you were to make a logo in Photoshop, and then you were to take that for a business card, let's say, of course I don't have any around me, so what do I have in reach here? So all right, we'll go with this. So there's this disc right here, and it's got some logo on the inside right there. All right, so if I took that same logo, blew it up to the side of a building so I could have a giant building side banner. If I was to do that in Photoshop, that graphic would be incredibly lossy. You'd be seeing, like, 6-inch by 6-inch squares all over your board that you printed up for that big giant banner. Whereas if you were to do the graphic as vector inside of Illustrator or another program similar to it, you'd end up with very accurate lines even at that giant scale, because everything is mathematically scaled up and then converted to pixels. Whereas if you're at a pixel, you're kind of stuck at that. All right. So that's why I think Vector is kind of more important for being able to do logos and things. And actually, that's what your milestone will be for this week. We'll get into that later, though. All right. So um, let's keep moving through the tools here. And what I kind of wanted to show you was the selection tools again. So I said that, let me make sure, get out of that. Okay, and you can see that jump right there between vector and, vector and rasterized or pixel. All right, so when I say it's made up of lines, if I select this, you can see that there is a path highlighted right there. That might be a little bit small to translate. And then there's an anchor here, and those translate to basically lines and points. Um, and then we have two selection tools here, and one is going to be V, and it's going to be this top one. It's synonymous with the Move tool in Photoshop. So if I click on something, it's going to select the entire thing. I can click on the lines, on the anchors and the paths, but it's going to select the entire object. Now if I move over to the direct selection tool, that one's a little bit more specific, and if I hit A, I can select that on the keyboard as well. Now if I click on this anchor point, you can see that only that one highlighted. And then you can also see that I only have that little corner rounding thing modifier right here, and I don't have it in this corner right here. If I click on that one corner, I can also modify this one, but it doesn't affect any of the others, all right? So when you're working in Illustrator, you have to remember that these are a series of points and lines, and the sort of generic selection tool will select the entire object that you're looking at, whereas the direct selection tool will only select that specific thing. Now, I can select part of this, like say hit delete, and you can see that it draws, point to point, and then fill in that area, or fills in that area with fill. Um, but it only deleted the ones that I selected in that way. So if I just do that corner right there, I can do that. I can do that and separate this into two objects. Excuse me. So you have some flexibility in how you select things, whereas in Photoshop it was more of a isolate parts of the images and then edit those, stack layers on top of each other. Now you do have something similar to layers in here, and let me see if I can pull that up. Well, and there is technically literally, oh, they're there. Okay, so you do have layers, but inside of here, let me kind of stack things together. You have sort of grouped layers, and then everything inside of that layer is stacked. So when we were in Photoshop, you were working on a layer. If you edited that layer, that was it. That pixel only had that depth of that layer, and if you wanted anything else, you had to add layers. In Illustrator, you can actually stack things on top of each other, and they will sort themselves by order. They'll sort themselves by order inside of here. So now I've got these three shapes, and no matter what I do, they haven't lost anything. They're still all here, even if I stack them on top of each other inside of this layer. So I think Illustrator gives you a much more powerful and easy to use tool for being able to combine certain graphical elements on top of each other, and then to create logos and things that you can combine stuff with. I think Illustrator works really well for doing very specific things, um, especially once you get in the larger sheet sizes, whereas Photoshop is more for working with a very specific graphic. So if I'm working with a specific image or just a large page, I'll stick with Photoshop. If I'm going to be doing something more like multiple pages or banners, or a logo that could be scaled up, I will likely use Illustrator. I'd probably also use Illustrator for business cards and photo. Wow, thanks, Brain. No, we just completely forgot what that was. Oh, postcards. There we go. Business cards and postcards are something that I would also use Illustrator on. And then I would use a background I generated in Photoshop for that. So it just kind of depends. That's personal preference, but my workflow usually kind of depends on um, pixel graphics being generated in Photoshop, but then a lot of text and larger graphics being generated in Illustrator. And then later on this week, we'll actually be getting into InDesign, which is going to be more for laying out large presentations, banner size presentations, or what I'm used to doing is phone books with it. So it's much more flexible, but it's also oriented a little bit more towards print, but it's also strikingly similar to Illustrator. So that's why we're kind of doing those two in that order. All right. Anyway, so covered a couple things here. Now, one of the other things I wanted to point out, and it's kind of my favorite tool inside of Illustrator, is the pen tool. So if I click on this corner, and I delete it, now I'm just left with these two corners, or sorry, this triangle shape here. The pen tool right here, I think it's the most powerful tool in here, and it's what I use a lot. And I can actually, just by hovering over those corners, I can redraw that surface. Another thing I can do, you can see there's a little plus on the mouse right there, is I can click there and I can add a point. I can switch over to the direct selection tool, and I can move that point around. And then Shift C, which I don't even know where that, yeah, right there, okay. Under the pen tool menu is the anchor point control tool. And if you click on an anchor point, you can actually adjust the angles that go with that as well. I think I did that briefly. And if you find other spots too, you can go in and modify some of these. If you click on them directly without doing any movement, you can actually just reset it to default. And if you go through a circle, sometimes you can get it. Oh, this might have multiple anchor points. Yeah, it's got multiple anchor points on each spot. Do that. Yeah, I would have to move this. There we go. So by doing that, you can kind of simplify angles and get rid of any sort of weird, crazy, swoopy things you've got going on. All right. So those are kind of the main tools that you're going to be using in here. Now, I think that's good for this video. I'll get into kind of logo design and some other stuff in the next video. So let's cut this one, and we'll go on to the next.